Our next guest here at Uppsala International Literature Festival is a writer of international bestsellers, like this one. A storyteller whose novels had educated not only my mind and moved not only my heart, but millions of hearts. Since the debut 8 years ago with the widely acclaimed novel The Pearl That Broke Its Shell, Pärlan som sprängde sitt skal på svenska, an intricate story about the lives of two Afghan women during two historical eras. Then came the novel When the Moon is Low, När natten är som ljusast, a shocking story of an Afghan mother and her children fleeing the Taliban and Europe's closed borders. The novels A House Without Windows, One Half from the East, The Sky at Our Feet were all published at a rapid pace. The most recent novel is Sparks Like Stars that came last year. And Nadia Hashimi has shown through book after book that she's a great narrator with currently important content, conditions of Afghan women, forced migration, conflicts, poverty, misogyny, colonialism, abuse, and the problems of exile living between two worlds are all recurring themes, as are, of course, joy and love at the same time. There are complex portraits of women and girls, Rahima, Sheikba, Seba, Fereiba, Obaida, Sitara, and Ariana, among others. Excuse my pronunciations. They are all Hashimi's specialties. It is a true honor to welcome Nadia Hashimi to Uppsala, so far from both her homelands, United States and Afghanistan. Welcome.
Thank you, Mikael.
Was it correct to say that you have two homelands?
So I don't know if I'd consider Afghanistan my homeland. I think I consider Afghanistan the land of my ancestors. And I carry much of Afghanistan in me. And it's obvious, I think, in the stories I write. It's natural for me to write these types of stories and not other types of stories. So I think I, like many other Afghans, whether we're part of the diaspora or the second or the third generation, there is homeland within us. There are bits of homeland that make up ourselves. But if I were to call, which land would I call a homeland? I was born and raised in the United States, but as a product of the Afghan diaspora.
And at the same time, when you read, I mean, there's now 5 novels, huge epic stories, and they are not about primarily American everyday life. They're about Afghanistan. So, as a writer, you're truly at home in Afghanistan, no?
I'm very much at home in those stories because for me, these are the stories that were most compelling. As I was listening to what was happening in our households, as I was listening to what was happening to relatives who were still in Afghanistan, then these were the stories that drew my attention. And truthfully, what I write are stories that I wish I would have found on the shelves as a young reader. Yeah. Because I could find other people's stories. I could find stories of other lands, but I couldn't find stories that reminded me of home, that reminded me of things that I'd heard. And so really that's what these stories are, I think, are stories that I wish I could send back in time to myself. And I'm hoping to send them to others.
Still, you are sitting in your, as I presume, relatively safe home in Washington, and writing about, humans, women far, far away, and far, far from being safe. How are you able to?
Well, I think the distance is as wide or as narrow as we make it. right? And so, yes, Afghanistan can be on the other side of the planet, but especially in an age with the type of technology that we have, with the type of story sharing capability that we have, it can also be as near as we want it to be. So if I choose to, I can be in contact with people who are in Afghanistan. I can listen to their stories. I can hear their voices. I can ask them what's happening in their day. I can read the news. I can watch the videos that they're posting online. I can be as close as I want to be without actually even physically being there. That's not to say that I'm here to speak for them or to write stories on their behalf, but it's to say that I can be as engaged and as concerned and as involved as I want to be, no matter what the distance is.
You feel that when you read your novels that you're truly engaged, and they're so detailed as well into Afghan life, and so I heard that when Kabul recently fell into the hands of the Taliban again, I read somewhere that you were glued to the telephone and the computer. Who were you communicating with?
I would say most Afghans in the diaspora were at that point glued to some devices and in contact, because no matter who you're talking to, everybody has family, everybody has connections who are still there. And so in those moments, in those days, it was very difficult. You know, who was I talking to? I was talking to people who I'd come to know over the years, whether they were writers or women activists who I've been in touch with, and trying to figure out, you know, what happens now, especially as the urgency was growing, as it became a catastrophic situation, and as we were starting to see, you know, there are spreadsheets that you have to fill out. You have to get their names on these lists. You have to write down their tazkara numbers, their birth dates, and you know, gathering all these little tiny bits
to get
and
them
pieces
out, or
in order to get them out.
Yeah.
On this slim chance that maybe we could get somebody out.
Did you succeed with the people that you were in contact with?
I wish I had succeeded. I know a couple of people who got out, whether it was because I did something, I don't know, I doubt. I think there was just so many people doing so many things, and so much happened that we really don't know, you know, what efforts led to anything. We may never know, and I think that's okay too. But what is probably more important to know is that we were not able to get a lot of people out. We were not able to get out people who are at continued risk or in continued danger, and that's what really hurts, is, you know, the phone calls that we still have with relatives who are there, who are updating us and telling us that things have changed for the worse.
But you're still working at it to get them out, some of them more.
We're still working at it. Now, you know, there are new people that we've realized. There are new people that I've met in the past few months. There are people whose families have been divided, where within the chaos at the airport, some of the family members were able to come over, managed to get through the gates, and didn't even realize that the other half of the family was on the outside of the gates. Oh. And so now you have families that have literally been ripped apart. And what's going to happen there? So now there are some efforts to see, you know, will anything happen into reunifying these mothers with their children, these husbands with their wives, these broken pieces of family?
It's terrible stories. You've described that you, as a writer, in addition to the joy of storytelling, I mean, it's quite apparent that you really enjoy writing and telling stories, but it's also a channel for your commitment and activism. What are you specifically committed to or engaged in?
That's a good question. I think there's the power of storytelling is that it can have many effects, right? And so some people will tell me, they'll write me messages where they say, after they read the story, they decided to go and they really wanted to help refugees. And I've had, you know, a couple of physicians tell me that they decided they were going to go to Greece and work with the refugee population over there, for example. I've also seen others say that they, you know, how can we help with the women and the girls of Afghanistan? So sometimes when I write because I think now, I didn't know that then before I started writing, but now having heard from readers that I know that there is a power because people do things off of the pages. People close the last page of the book, and then they keep thinking They keep exploring. People tell me, I finished reading the story, or even better, halfway through the story, I put it down and I started Googling because I wanted to learn more.
Yeah.
Right.
I did as well.
And that's, I love that, right?
Yeah.
Yes, put the story down. The story's here for you. Go ahead and Google and learn a bit more. And that's what I'm writing for. I'm writing because I want to share some information with people that maybe they can do something with it. And it doesn't even have to be activism. Maybe it is just understanding your neighbors a bit better.
Yeah.
Maybe it is understanding what privilege you have in your space, in your community. Maybe it's even just a way for people to understand their own family dynamics, which is universal, transcultural, and international. But I also want these stories to be, and this might seem superficial in light of the challenges Afghanistan faces, but what I also want these stories to be is a crystallization, a little capture of Afghan culture.
Oh, yeah.
Because I think that's something that gets lost in conflict, that gets lost in bloodshed and casualties and statistics and corruption, is that within all of these tragedies are also little bits of Afghan culture. You know, the clothes that we wear, the foods we eat, the music that we're listening to, the poetry that lives in our homes. And so those are the things that I want to persist and live on beyond the stories.
What do you think that we as readers here in the Western world don't get about Afghanistan? That's a hard question, but you know, in general, what is it that we don't get?
That we're also happy. So I think what happens is that the stories about Afghanistan are deeply tragic, right? And those are the stories that come across on the news because it's true. It's been decades of conflict. It's poverty. It's oppression. It's amputations. I mean, it's everything that you could imagine that is horrible is happening in Afghanistan to a degree that is almost hard to comprehend. That how are people surviving this? And yet they are surviving this, broken, bruised, and all of that, and yet they're still laughing. Like, come to our weddings, come to our parties, and you will celebrate. You will be dancing. You will be laughing. You will be, sitting with a full stomach and feeling very happy. And that's the other part of the story that I think has been missing, which I think is very important because that's the human part.
Yeah, okay. So the effect about the news and the statistics and the violence is implicitly dehumanizing.
It's implicitly dehumanizing. It tells you, well, this is it. This is their story. This always has been their story. This always will be their story. But that is not true. And that's what's important, I think, to realize is that it is the moments that we're not laughing that's the heartbreak. And what are we supposed to get back to is the joy.
As a male, a short reflection on that. As a male reader, I also feel that there's something very special and universal about reading novel after novel with female main protagonists, because it also, in a universal sense, gives me as a part of masculinity, so to say, to a window to look into female, the female mind. Is that an aspect that you've?
I wouldn't say I've intentionally created these to give people a window into the female mind. I think I write from the perspective that I know, but I also try to write male characters who are reflections of the way I see the males around me thinking, right? Or and not just the ones that are in my household, but the ones that we're observing, because we have to pull the pieces together and try to understand how the other is thinking. But
it's also part of the because in culture there's also this strand of, I think, dehumanization of the female in popular culture, for example. And these novels are the antithesis. They are like giving life and aspect and nuances that are really important.
It is important, I think, to not see we can write stories in very different ways, right? We can say that, look at this person. I think, look at the language that we use now. We don't call people victims, we call them survivors, right? And so it's probably in terms of, you know, when we watch a movie, where is the camera angle placed? Is it placed behind me so that you can see what I see, or is it, is it, and hopefully maybe that's what these stories are doing, is kind of bringing people to see from a very different perspective, and one that they might not have considered before.
Yeah. You mentioned your home. You're also a pediatrician, a doctor, and your husband, Amin, who's here, Amini. There you are. He said something beautiful yesterday or the day before, that as a doctor you care about the health of one person at a time, but as a writer you care about the health of thousands, millions at the same time. Do you feel that? Because now you're a full-time writer, no? Or
sort of, yes.
Sort of, sort of, yeah.
Sort it is true. It's been, I think, humbling to realize the reach of the stories. You know, as a physician, you sit with one person at a time, but in the same way that public health is so important, and we realize that in the age of, you know, COVID and pandemia, that public health is very important. Just as important, or maybe more important, than sitting individually one patient at a time. And storytelling is also critically important, because we send things out, and the beauty of these stories is that they can be shared, they can be distributed. Somebody picks up a book and then they give it to somebody who trusts them enough to take that recommendation, and the stories sort of travel. So, and I think that's why I am staying in it, because when I hear the feedback from people, it is very encouraging to know that stories do grow wings and make it to places that I would not be able to reach. They make it into rooms where I would not be able to sit and have that conversation.
I mean, you're working in a country, or you're writing in a country, and you have your home there, who has been partly responsible for a lot of the suffering in Afghanistan. So what kind of reactions do you have on your books among Americans?
Various reactions. I mean, I think readers are smart people, right? And most people who read books are reading them because they already are starting with a baseline of empathy. They're starting with curiosity, and they're starting with having a bit of an open mind already. And so those are the people that I think it's been powerful to reach, because especially with, you know, Sparks Like Stars, for example, is people starting to understand what was the role of the United States. What presence did the United States have in Afghanistan in the years before there was any war? What impact was it? Was it all just because we wanted to be friends? Was it all, you know, cheerful and just, you know, money flowing this way and that way and just partying? No, there was more to it. There was intention to it. And so in the events that followed, there is some moral responsibility for the United States. And that's even early on, of course, in the years that came later. And it's been mostly in the discussions that happen after the books, too, where I try to be very direct with people, very honest, because now I feel a responsibility to do so, for people to know what the impact of our policies have been on Afghan people, because the people of Afghanistan are not necessarily in those rooms, in those spaces, to be able to speak to the impact and those effects. And it's hard to hear. We know that it's hard to hear. But I think there's an appreciation for that information.
Have you heard from any American policymakers reading your books?
That, no, I can't say that I've heard. Maybe that's where I need to send them.
Okay. Now, for all of you that hasn't yet have the privilege to read anything, we'd like to read a small part from your latest novels.
Sure.
Sparks Like Stars.
Yes.
So you'll get a taste of it, okay? This is prologue.
This is the prologue, so it basically sets the tone. And this is a story that's told in the first person. So. Until now, my history has remained buried in me the way ancient civilizations are hidden beneath layers of earth and new life. But people insist on digging into the past, poking at relics of yesterday to marvel at the simplicity of extinct creatures. We display the evidence of our superiority in glass cases, housed in grand buildings sometimes half a world away from where they were found. In London, I saw the Elgin marbles lifted from the Parthenon, the Guiagal shield stolen from Aboriginal Australians, and the brilliant Koh-i-Noor diamond. In the language of my childhood, Koh-i-Noor means the mountain of light, a name that obscures the diamond's dark history. But I cannot be too critical, not while I have my own plundered treasure in a box far from where it was unearthed. How it came to be with me is a story that I've never wholly told, not to the woman who helped me flee a country on fire, not to the woman who raised me as an American, and not to the man I almost loved. Were it not for the day my buried life appeared before me unannounced, I might have kept it all hidden forever, and I might not have asked those questions I'd stifled to preserve this unexamined life. What are you? I have been asked as I pay for my coffee, as I check out a book at the library, as I explain to my last patient of the day how I will remove the tumor growing inside him. As if I am a species and not a person. People throw identities at me and look to see if one will stick. Greek, Italian, Lebanese, Argentinian, Eastern European. I trigger a railroad switch and divert their questions away from crates of ammunition and streams of pity and preserve for myself the first and only peaceful decade of my life. But untold histories live in shallow graves. Some nights the cold wakes me and I find I've clawed my way out from under the covers. I count the stars to catch my breath. Once upon a time, a little girl with velvet ribbons in her hair crouched deep in the belly of a palace, tucked behind copper pots and urns and cartons heavy with treasures of a lost world. Each time she was shaken by the urge to scream, she plunged her teeth into the soft flesh of her forearm. She knew only that she should remain perfectly silent and prayed no one would hear the thin echo of the song her father would sing when he found her awake well past her bedtime. While I slumber, you are open-eyed. I am naive, but you are ever wise. Because of him, or in spite of him, she did not wail in the dark. Meters above her, soldiers wandered, some solemnly and others less so, through the warren of hallways. Walls were marked with crimson splatters, the fingerprints of revolution. A general, feeling presidential, slid into a plush Victorian sofa and traced the curves of its lacquered arms. His chest puffed to think that people would soon come to appreciate the sacrifices he'd made tonight for the greater good. He stood and walked across a hand-knotted burgundy carpet, delicate white flowers laced through an elephant's foot motif. He checked the sole of his left boot, then his right. He needn't have worried, though. An Afghan carpet, perhaps by design, conceals blood just as well as it conceals spilled tea. The city, a halo around the palace, waited on an announcement from the president to explain the sight of Sukhoi jets and the sound of gunfire. American diplomats stationed in Kabul, some still fuzzy from cocktails, wondered what bizarre conflict had fallen their peaceful and exotic post. One silver-haired American woman, teetering from the effects of a stubby cigarette she'd purchased off a hippie couple, tried to touch the paper airplanes that soared over her head. She applauded the flash of fireworks, as Americans do. Never, that little girl in the palace knew with brutal certainty, had any child in history been more alone. On that night, giants were felled. A dizzying void swallowed all that had once been. But the trembling little girl could not succumb. She would be brave, because her father had once told her that the world lived within her, that her bones were made of mountains, that rivers coursed through her veins, that her heartbeat was the sound of 1,000 pounding hooves, that her eyes glittered with the light of a starry sky. I am that girl, and this is my story.
That's the beginning of Sparks Like Stars. You touch on the question of identity in this prologue. People are trying to place her. Is that you've said somewhere that you are surrounded by Afghan culture and language in your everyday life, but do you still feel American, or do you feel that you're both or everything?
I feel everything, and I think it is very American to feel both, to feel a multitude of identities and to feel enriched by cultures that are different from my own, and to feel that I am enriching the lives of others too, just by being here and by adding to the fabric of the country as well. I don't think I always felt that way. I think especially, there are periods when you're younger and you wonder how you fit in and what kind of integration means and why is my family different than what everybody else looks like, and especially depending on where you live. But at this point now, I think I feel whole. I don't think that I'm broken pieces put together.
There were some question marks, though, 19 years ago, or more. It's 21 years ago, 9/11. Weren't that a kind of a difficult period for you?
Difficult period, of course, in America's history. And for the Afghan-American community, it was a difficult period because we were all of a sudden no longer anonymous. And, that's one of this is not my story. Sparks Like Stars is not my story. There are some logistical similarities where she's a physician. We were both in New York on 9/11. We're both sort of this Afghan-American identity. But that's really where it ends. But at that moment, and that's why that period of history is also included in the story, because it was one that really shifted for the Afghan-American community, where before that we were completely anonymous. You could talk to American people, they wouldn't know where Afghanistan was on a map, they couldn't find it. And then that abruptly and very acutely changed. And it didn't really change for the better, right in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. And that was the first time that I sort of felt like, well, people were looking at me, looking at my family in a different way. And we were fortunate that we didn't get the brunt of it, we didn't get the worst of it. I know other people who got far worse of the backlash, until people could start of, sift through the news and start to understand what had happened in Afghanistan and what was the whole connection to 9/11.
So it has been gone to the better, so to say.
It's gone to the better, and I think that I have put myself in places where it has gone to the better. You see a lot of, friendships, especially now in the aftermath of this evacuation and how messy the situation has been, friendships between American veterans and the newly arrived Afghans. So communities have come together. There's a lot of positive. I think that's really important too, is to give people the good that's happening, and hopefully that it's a model for what others could be replicating.
Let's turn to the more negative sides again. It's more interesting, I think, the dark sides. There is this beautiful novel that is really moving, When the Moon is Low, your second novel, När natten är som ljusast in Swedish. We follow a family whose happy middle-class life implodes when the Taliban rises to power and they are forced to flee, a mother and 3 children. It is a realistic and frightening story about a hard life on the streets of an unwelcoming Europe. What kind of research did you do to write this very detailed story about the sufferings of a Afghan family on the run in Europe?
So, this story I wrote the manuscript for this story in 2009 to 2010. So it was before we really had the explosion across the world in refugees. And it started from a newspaper article that my cousin had sent me about a teenage Afghan boy who exemplified other teenage Afghan boys who had sort of, left the homeland and made his way alone into Europe and was sort of stuck in Greece in this, couldn't go forward, couldn't go back. And I really wanted to write a story that talked about it. Now, immigration and, refugee status was something that I grew up hearing about, because this was like kitchen table talk. This is all the family would talk about is, who is where did they get to, where did the smuggler take the person, did they have to turn back, and affidavits and filing for these immigration papers, and all of that was what we grew up talking about all the time or just hearing. And so I wanted to talk about, what happens to people who are trying to make their way but don't really have a path, and what happens when they get stuck. Because that's what I was hearing about, because I was, hearing a certain wavelength that maybe my neighbors weren't, and that was the story that I wanted to get out there. And so the research came from bits and pieces of the stories of my own relatives, things that I'd been hearing when I was, as I was growing up and family left the country, but then also, diving into the richness of really the internet, where if you keep digging, you can find first-person accounts, you can find videos that will show you where people are trying to run the lengths of railroad lines and hopping onto the backs of trucks and the risks that they're taking. And when you look, it's right there in front of you. So that's where it really came from, was taking a look at not only my own family, but what people were able to see. We have the luxury of seeing this stuff if we choose to.
We're in the middle of a refugee crisis again now in Europe, and this time it's the war in Ukraine. But there are some differences in reception. What are your thoughts about this? If you compare to what happened to Afghan refugees, and in your novel, for example, and what is now happening to the refugees of Ukraine?
There's definitely a difference. And as many Afghans, as many people have pointed out, the treatment and the welcoming that the Ukrainians are receiving is maybe the gold standard right now. That's what we should all be striving for anybody. So whatever grievances we have is not to say that why are you treating the Ukrainians so well? It is that, so we do know how to do this, but we don't always do it that way. And that's not just to say that it's happening in Europe. I think the United States has the same track record, right? We offered temporary protection status to the Ukrainians within 7 days. But the Afghans who left, or who were in the United States, didn't get that temporary protection status for months and months. So, I've been thinking about it, and it's sort of like when I do my laundry, there's, I put all the whites in one pile over here, and then it's everything else goes in this bucket. And so it seems like our global policies have that kind of mentality, right? Where it's like, okay, this is the West, where everything has to stay, neat and clean and everything. And then whatever else is left can be mixed in, and it's lumped in with a completely different policy.
Okay, that's a nice analogy.
But really, it shows that there's a complete difference in the way we're approaching the situation. And when we think about refugees, we're thinking about people who are, we define it in a way where it is a qualifying process. We have to know, well, what exactly are you running from? Are you politically persecuted? Are you this? Are you that? When really these refugees are running from war. They're running from gunfire. They're running from danger to their lives. And that's where we start, right? That's where we start, is like, are you in danger? Then yes, you need help.
One thought that comes to mind is also that there is this literary challenge, really, for storytellers, that when European and American politicians explain the difference in reception with Ukrainians are kind of closer to us, then you feel that you really need novels like this, because what you get through this is that you get close to people. Have you had that reactions from American readers that, well, now I'm beginning to grasp what it is to living in Afghanistan? Or?
Yeah, and I think that's what stories have done for me as a reader, right? I have read a lot of novels around World War II. It helps me understand what people went through. And I do the same for other parts of the globe. I try to read intentionally from different areas, and this is what stories do. Not my stories. This is what stories do, is to bridge that gap, as well as things that people are doing. Like in my community, one of the nicest things that's happened is that people have gotten together and cooked food. And then they take that food, people go online, they follow. For example, my dad was teaching people how to cook a butternut squash soup. And so when he was doing this cooking video online, there were several people who were in their homes following along and also cooking. And this was done intentionally. everyone at the end of it packaged up these batches, and it was then going to be delivered to refugee families who had just arrived. And for one of these sessions, the intention was not just to kind of drop it off in a box, but it was that everybody was matched with a family to go ahead and drop it off, so that you would have a moment where these two families met, a connection. Because when people meet, that's when sort of all these myths and stereotypes and these walls that we create, they all just kind of come down, and you say, oh, so your child is whining just like mine and trying to get your phone, and you're also struggling to kind of get your bags together, and there's just, that's when the humanity really shines through. That's where the commonalities shine through, and that's where I think whether it's storytelling or actually breaking bread together or being in a shared space, that kind of brings us to a place of better understanding.
Just a thought. I mean, now last year, for example, we've also experienced that the place where you're living, United States, is also a kind of divided country with a lot of like different living conditions and a lot of polarized opinions and stuff. Have you ever reflected on the need for stories to connect these very huge divisions within United States to do something about it?
Yes. Oh, so you've heard about our problems then, huh?
Well, sort of. Sort of.
It's no secret. I think that's really, there are entities in the United States too that understand it, because it's very easy to kind of put people into boxes and say, well, no, you are this and you are that.
You're a redneck.
These two should absolutely never meet, and there's nothing overlapping and nothing that's in the middle. But there is common ground, and there are places where people come together. I mean, look at a sporting event, right? Like there's all of America then flocks to the sporting events. And there are things that I think that, unfortunately sometimes it is, for example, looking at what's happening in the Ukraine, that brings a lot of Americans together. But it has to be done intentionally. And it seems like what is hot, what is sexy, what sells a lot and gathers a lot of attention is when people are at each other, when people are arguing with each other. I think we have to change the way we think and kind of get back to what we teach our children in kindergarten, right? It's like, no, you should be able to share. You should be able to get along. Because it is not good to look for sensationalism in division. But that's really what fuels the media, that's what fuels our attention. It is looking for that divisiveness and all the friction, like the more friction, the better.
Well, there was also, this huge friction that came in the world as a whole when it came to 9/11. How did you react? You were young then, but when the American administration's answer to 9/11 was to invade Afghanistan, what do you feel at that moment?
So for us, I think, and I can't speak for all Afghans. I won't speak for all Afghans. I can say that that for me, within our household, with my family, we kind of felt like, did we finally get your attention? Not in that, that we had something to do with 9/11, but it was like, wow, did this thing actually finally get your attention? Because all of a sudden we were looking at what was happening in Afghanistan. We realized, oh, there are terrorists who've been living in Afghanistan with safe harbor. Why? Oh, because Afghanistan is being run and controlled by this Taliban group. And what are they doing? Oh, they're not letting girls go to school. They're not letting women work. They're not letting women wear nail polish, or they're going to have their fingernails ripped off. We knew that was happening because we all had connections to the country, but it was like nobody else knew about it. So I think there was some initial relief of like, well, maybe this will free the country of this oppression and kind of, finally give people a chance to breathe. But we didn't know which way it was going to go. But the initial reaction almost was like, okay, will this actually finally let in a bit of sunlight?
Yeah. One of the implied arguments for invading and toppling the Taliban regime was to liberate Afghan women and girls. And since you've been writing a lot about them now and in historical times, how did it turn out eventually, do you think? The liberating...
There were 20 years where women and girls were, again, to a much better extent, to a much greater extent, permitted to be part of the public life, right? So the girls were going to school, and you had about 40% of the student population in Afghanistan was made up by girls. You had women graduating from universities with advanced degrees. You had some graduating classes which were actually a majority of women more than men. You had women who were serving in parliament, who had served as a governor, one ran for vice president. You had women who were judges. You had women who were journalists. You had women who were pop stars and everything. Oh, yeah. And so a lot happened, a lot improved, which was not done only by the hands of the Western community saying, okay, now we're going to let you do all of this stuff. But it was really by the blood, sweat, and tears of the Afghan girls and women and their families who made all of this happen.
Movement, so to say.
Yes, yeah. Yes. Because none of it happens alone. It happens through partnership and shared struggle. But what happened is that in the moment that the United States decided it was going to leave, it did so without providing any contingencies, without providing any kind of safeguard, without institutionalizing these rights in a way where we could say that, okay, it's going to persist when we depart. And unfortunately, that is what has fallen apart, is the rights of women, the rights of girls. So the rights that were enshrined in the Constitution of Afghanistan, well, the Constitution has been done away with. There's no Constitution now. The rights that girls had to go to school, you can see that in the last couple days, they were denied once again. So girls who were supposed to go, from above 6th grade to the rest of high school, oh, no, actually, you girls, never mind, you can't go back to school. And so you have a lot of really broken-hearted girls who have no reason to have any ambition. They're really feeling very destitute right now. And they're feeling, I think, forgotten. And that's the problem with these conflict zones, right? Some people are displaced from their homes. Afghan girls and women have been, to some extent, displaced from their homes, but in other ways, they've been displaced from people's minds, from people's priorities.
But still there is... there was a movement, and there's been 20 years of gathering strength, so to say. Do you feel that the Taliban, if you would write a novel about the situation today, do you feel that the Taliban has to handle a much stronger female movement now than before?
For sure. I can't say 100%, but what we have in the last 2 days, we've had schoolgirls marching, protesting.
In Kabul?
In Kabul, yeah. I don't know if we had that between 96 and 01. I don't know if they had the will to do that then.
What are they risking now?
Well, what we do know is for women who have gone protesting, for women who are activists, who are women who have dared to be outspoken in the face of this new, unreformed Taliban, is that there have been women disappearing, there have been interrogations and detentions, there have been killings, and God knows what we don't know. So, are these girls risking that? I don't know, but I know that a lot of us who are watching from afar, part of us wants to go, yes, go, march, resist, fight, and then part of us is saying,
watch out.
Watch out.
Oh. This is, it's very appropriate.
Very appropriate.
This is a highway to hell. Sorry. Okay, that's the alarm. It's an alarming situation, isn't it?
It is.
Yes.
It is.
Just to round off, speaking about, we've spoken about your books, and in one of your novels, one of the claimed successes of imposing democracy after the invasion is there is a story in your books about the wife of a really brutal warlord, Abdul Khalih. She is made member of the parliament, but she only votes as being told by her husband. Is that a reality, some kind of charade where you have female participation, but you have the old system still working in the shadows?
So, well, now you don't have any women. You don't have any system, right? But at that time, I think in the last 20 years, you have a good amount of women who were in the parliament. 20 to 25% of the parliament was being made up by women. And I think you can look and see that many of those women, the majority of those women, were vocal, were strong, were adamant, and they took on a lot of risks to even serve in that role because it put them in a very public space, and campaigning in a country which had kind of reverted to a very conservative outlook was not easy, right? So a lot of these women faced attacks, verbal or otherwise, on them and their families. But there probably were some women in there, and that's what I had heard from people who had been involved with the parliament, was that there were, some who were really there but controlled. Yeah. And, the thing is, you don't break away from patriarchy overnight, right? You can't undo all of that overnight. The other thing that it makes me think of is, how many of American politicians are really controlled by financial interests, lobbying groups, and while they themselves might want to vote a certain way, there they are representing the interests of somebody else. And so it's just, it's a different form of the same problem.
Yeah, you should know because you ran for office. Yes, in 2018, you ran for the Democratic seat in Congress, no?
I did, but I didn't win, and so I get to have this seat here with you.
Yeah. That's perfect. Okay, now the final question. When Kabul fell into Taliban hands once again, you wrote an essay on NPR stating, "The dark waters are made brighter knowing that this moment may be far from happy, but it is also not the end." So what signs of hope for a brighter, freer future do you see for the people of Afghanistan? Do you see any hopes?
I do see some hope because, as you've seen, as you talked about, the young girls in Afghanistan are not going to take this lying down. The people of Afghanistan have seen a very different world, right? It's very young people, and they're going to continue to see what's happening in the world outside because they have access to social media. They're talking to people outside, and so it is not like they have, just closed the gates and they can lock all of the Afghans in. And as we can see also, the Taliban have not really been able to provide for the people of Afghanistan. People are starving right now. It's a humanitarian crisis. And when they ask, Taliban leaders, what are you going to do? They say, well, it's not our job to provide food for them. That's God's job, right? And so you're not really going to have a population that is very happy with this, group, this regime that's come into power. It will not last. I don't know how long it will go, and I don't know what will turn the tables on them, but I don't think that this is a sustainable form of control. That's what gives me hope. I've met a lot of families now and children who have come over in this group of refugees. That's the group I've been working with for the past few months. And, the girls come in, and I had one teenage girl tell me, please bring me polynomials. And I had to stop and say, what do you mean polynomials? And we were teaching some math and basics. And she said, no, but I want polynomials.
Whoa, what's that?
It's high school math, like things that I have not looked at in a very long time, solving these equations, right? And so when I understood what she wanted, I said, okay, so I went back and I printed out worksheets online of like how to solve polynomial equations and, But these are the children, these are the girls who were growing up in Afghanistan. This is the hunger that they had. They were reading novels. They were reading books about different time periods. I've asked them, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be a pilot. I want to be a doctor. Yes. Oh. So, you can't just turn the lights off and think that they're not still there. There's ideas, that ambition, that desire is still there.
That's hopeful, and we'll end on that hopeful note today. But we'll hopefully not see the end of your productivity, Nadia Hashimi. I envy you all that have yet to discover her novels. They are beautiful, enchanting, and horrible stories about human beings like us, only Afghan ones. And that is, I think, the most important lessons of Nadia Hashimi's books. We are all human beings with different and sometimes really unjust fates. A million thanks for educating and entertaining us, Nadia Hashimi. And thanks to Amin Amini, her husband, that followed her this long way across the sea. Now, there's an exclusive offer for today. You can get a very few signed copies here of her earlier books, the ones that are translated. You can buy them for only 150 kronos, but you'll get them signed, and all the money will go to Svenska Pens akutfond for help in emergency matters like Ukraine, for example. So you're all welcome to, and I think we'll do the signing just outside the door. And there's only a limited edition. I think we have these books, so be fast. Okay. And then I want to thank, of course, everyone that made this possible, this long journey possible. Uppsala International Literature Festival, Kholod Sagir, Kinderkreidi, The Orient, and Cecilia Hörnell Sunar, and all the supporting partners. Okej, på svenska. Om en liten stund så följer en spännande programpunkt. Internationella poeter kommer att läsas. Narla El-Tum och vem var det mer? Aya Kambar kommer att läsas här om en liten stund. Så välkomna tillbaka. Då så, därmed är det slut för idag. Tack.
Thank you.
Thank you.